Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? So we've seen and heard 1,001 ways of learning with the tour de force of Johannes, and the project's taking place here for quite a while now. But I would like to ask what that actually means artistically, poetically within this valley. Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus, who lived from 1707 to 1778, we see him here as an old white dude, left the scientific world an important legacy. His system for naming plants provides us with a standard way of classifying organisms. Because of him, we can use a common descriptive language for all living things based on plants. Linnaeus was an explorer as well as a scholar, seeking out new knowledge and mounting expeditions to then little-known regions within the world. He was a doctor, a lecturer, and a prolific writer. His path is typical for researchers in the 18th century, his endeavors becoming part of a movement of colonization, classifying plants and animals and humans according to European thought. Linnaeus' early love of plants and desire for discovery led him to become a scientist instead of a priest and take up medicine instead of preaching to the lambs. During his studies, he came to believe he had been chosen by the Creator for the task of classifying all living things. The plan to embark on this ambitious task originally formed in discussion with his friend Peter Artedi. The two men divided up the natural world between them, with Artedi starting on fishes, becoming the father of ichthyology. Ironically, Artedi drowned in a canal in Amsterdam at 30. An epitaph written in Latin by Anders Celsius and translated into English by George Shaw is known because it was inscribed on the back flyleaf of Linnaeus' own copy of Ichthyologia, the Learning of Fish, the book that Artedi wrote, and it goes like this. Here lies poor Artedi in foreign land fixed, not a man nor a fish, but something betwixt, not a man for his life among fishes he passed, not a fish for he perished by water at last. Both men seem to have been slightly obsessive. Linnaeus' system is based on a hierarchy, as God has a plan. Plants are organized into classes and orders according to the similarities. His system worked because it was both simple and systematic. The simplicity of his classification system lay in the fact that he based it on the arrangement of plant reproductive organs, the female pistils and the male stamens in the flower. This approach scandalized many of his critics at the time, but its reliance on sex probably helped to popularize his system. This was no doubt aided by Linnaeus' very poetic descriptions of the flowers in his scientific papers, referring to the pistil as a bride and the stamen as a bridegroom. The Swedish author August Strindberg wrote of him, Linnaeus was actually a poet who happened to become a naturalist. To understand plants better, he did something unheard of scientists before. He bought a farm outside of the old university town of Uppsala in Sweden, where he taught medicine and started a garden to study plants where they grow. He also plastered the walls of his rooms in the farm with expensive hand-colored prints of plants, claiming that the translation into art helped him better understand the innermost secrets of nature, the abundance of form and creation, so to speak. To him, plants illuminated the soul and the mind. And today, we already saw this. Markus Mäder is listening to the sounds of biodiversity. Steiner Lenzlinger observe how potatoes react to new neighbors. And Badel Sarbach are obsessed with the eyes of fish. Has everyone gone completely mad like Linus and Ottedi, or are they discovering new ways of learning from the earth, as the title of the Safjenthal Biennial suggests? A characteristic of contemporary art is the simultaneity of the most diverse practices that open equal spaces for thought. While many artists continue to deal phenomenologically with the landscape of the 18th century and choose to intersect or overlap it with the furnishings of the landscape by tourism, capitalism, or hunting as a socio-cultural practice, other artists, like the ones mentioned before, have been working on concepts of nature that question and replace the landscape as a spiritual buffer zone between man and nature, or to Linus, between man and God. They listen, observe, and can become obsessed. Can we learn from the earth, they ask? Does this kind of learning create its own poetics? The art of conceiving the world poetically is, as we know, a skill. It evades logic and it also accompanies it. Work created from the spirit honors natural forces as well as the Western canon and global ideas. Art appears as imagination, as a possible way of creating a shared planet. Artistic knowledge created from this understanding is a space of gathering and reunion, just like we do here and today. A traditional form of learning and engagement, as practiced for millennia by the people of the Amazon, presented in the video by Ursula Biemann. Her film, Forest Mind, we will see tonight, functions like a prism that focuses our ignorance, our lostness in the face of planetary questions, our inability to overcome the artificial dichotomy between nature and humanity. Can our thinking gain depth by integrating traditions that cultivate a holistic vision of nature? Do we have to learn from the earth to face the Anthropocene? The knowledge that nature can impart to us directly is faced facetedly by the people of the industrialized countries. In contrast, indigenous peoples have culturally integrated knowledge of nature's intelligence. With the help of research findings and recourse to Amerindian perspectives on healing and communication, Biemann sets out in her video essay from the perspective of the forest on a quest to make the potential of this wealth of experiences effective. The moment in time, as created by artists for and from the soils in the Safjenthal, as we've seen, presents in this reading both a moment of common experience and a form of performing and enacting of communality. But despite all the books, titles and lectures, symposiums, and research-based work of art, we are still not living in the Anthropocene. Since August 2016, the International Commission of Stratigraphy has finally had the official recommendation of one of its commissions to introduce a new geological epoch into its geological periodization, in which the influence of humans in the Earth stratum has become visible. So far, however, the Anthropocene is not yet a formalized geological term. Instead, in July 2018, the Commission introduced a more precise subdivision of the Holocene. Along with the Greenlandian and the North Grippian, there is now a name for the period of the last 4,250 years. Welcome, we live in the Megalion. However, the landscape that characterized the Megalion, or more precisely, their representation, pose a poetological problem. Max Frisch's Der Mensch erscheint im Holocene, Man in the Holocene in English, published in 1979, was already pointing that out. And even though hardly anyone may have noticed synchronicity at the time, the mountains, the forests, rivers, and lakes maybe registered it on a deeper level. Max Frisch's novel explores the attempted escape of the protagonist, Herr Geiser, into the landscape of the Ticino as an attempt at healing. His painstakingly assembled systems of knowledge have become obsolete. just like Linnaeus or ours. As our planet and its systems evolve in the megaleium, man remains in the Holocene. Mr. Geiser not only suffers from progressive dementia or Alzheimer's, but he also becomes estranged from his fellow inhabitants, a cat, which he finally roasts over the fire without eating it, and a fire salamander. As nature around him becomes hostile and life-threatening, there is an apocalyptic storm. He builds Chinese pagodas out of crisp bread in complete isolation and seclusion in his house in the mountain village, and categorizes the thunder of the storm, for example, into bang thunder or polter thunder. The Anthropocene, despite its status as a category of thought, as a mere presposal, has made an astonishing academic career in the last decade. The attractiveness of the concept lies in its radiance as not merely a geochronological and thus diffuse topoi, but as an ontology and theory of history, implying a post-human future for our planet by perversely centering it around the anthropos, the current human. This omnicompetence of the term refers to its vagueness and opaqueness, of course. As Dipesh Chakrabarty already showed 10 years ago, it breaks the classical separation of the temporalities of res naturae and res humanae, of natural history and human history, but does not itself provide a new guiding scheme beyond culture and human ideas. The collapse of the human nature difference, the artificial dichotomy, can thus be understood on the one hand as an empowerment, or on the other hand as a further decentering of the human being. The concept of the Anthropocene and the anthropos within it are thus the subject of an interpretative struggle for the discursive return of the human as the center of thought. So if we rethink nature and landscape, do we automatically have to rethink placing ourselves at the center of everything? Should we learn with the earth instead of learning from it? In his essay, The Storyteller, Walter Benjamin remarks on this as follows, I quote, "The art of storytelling is reaching its end because the epic side of truth, wisdom, is dying out. This, however, is a process that has been going on for a long time, and nothing would be more fatuous than to want to see in it merely a symptom of decay, let alone modern symptom. It is, rather, only concomitant symptom of the specular productive force of history, a concomitant that has quite gradually removed narrative from the realm of living speech, and at the same time is making it possible to see a new beauty in what is vanishing." End of quote. The humanist, architect, and art theorist Leon Battista Alberti, another old white dude, suggested in 1435 that art should be henceforth be placed in an eternal dichotomy between unattainable self-love, deception, and self-awareness. For him, the reflection of the self, Narcissus, lies at the beginning of all art. With the rising concern for ecology and climate change, though, we can no longer imagine nature being outside of us, of the polis of thinking, signifying the non-human, the other, the external. Within this context, the artworks present in the Safiental imagine possible futures of discourse. How can artistic propositions become projects of genuine learning and ongoing inquiry? How can we reconnect to the soil of our planet and reflect ourselves in its pools? Invoking new perspectives on what life and science could look like, perhaps it is necessary to question the future to come, rooted in the mud, living in the trees, frozen in the melting glaciers, and in the DNA of extinct species, but also in the poetry and visions of common ancestors, the vegetal and the mineral. The Life of Plants, a publication by Emanuele Coccia, develops an original phytophilosophy, very much along such thinking, and argues that plants are the medium through which we perceive and experience the world as we breathe the air they create. The future we learn in this new philosophy is thought by some to be not human but post-human. That is, we will no longer be able to recognize ourselves as ourselves if we continue to distance ourselves from ourselves as beings. The plants of Linnaeus' garden were also on the walls as pictures, but also creating the air, so to speak, of abundance from which we work and learn and create. The landscape, on the other hand, with its mountains and forests, lakes and rivers, furnishings such as farmhouses and hotels, as well as its inhabitants, us humans and other animals, watches these shifts in thinking. It has been and is being changed by us, but takes precious little interest in the post-human concept. In reaction to this disinterest, Benjamin's storyteller might revert to the genre conventions of the Gothic novel narrative and its formula of negative aesthetics. Just as the post-human subject is structured around the loss of autonomy of the human interior from what lies outside, so Gothic fiction follows what Eva Koskowski-Sedgwick has identified as a particular model of space, structured around the tensions of fragile, beleaguered interiors. That is, Mr. Geiser's home in the mountains, or the other artworks we see here in the valley. Benvautier, for example, reintroduces the concept of the terrain vague, which is a term coined by Ignacio de Sola Morales, describes a vacant, unused lot within a city as a space of chance. It examines the connections of urbanization, architecture, art, and possible social changes through shifting perception. As Luc Levesque writes in his short essay, The Terrain Vague is Material, Some Observations, I quote, "In this way, shifting from factual observation of the vacant lot to the more abstract of interstitial space expands our perspective to include a range of notions apt to stimulate discussion. Whether linked directly to the terrain vague or not, etymologically, interstitial denotes something found between things. Referring to the notion of interval, it also means solace of time. Thus, the interstitial embraces not only such notions as openness, porosity, breach, and relationship, but also those of process, transformation, and location. Applying this to the spaces of the valley and those in between, to the rivers and mountains, pastoral land, and landscapes of cultivated nature, art creates a Gothic conflict of storytelling between what is inside, what is outside, and what separates the two spheres, the sublime and uncanny. The sublime can be defined as the experience of that which overwhelms the self with the idea of overwhelming power, like the mountains around us. They surround us like the bones of dead dragons. The landscape is at least as much a landscape of the mind as the Chinese literati taught us, as geological stratifications of the megalithum. Jean Baudrillard has dealt with this aesthetic side of the phenomena and the uncanny. The revolution in information technology has dissolved the limits that exist for the mechanical reproduction of images. Knowledge, data, and culture can now be processed, disseminated, and copied as often and as quickly as desired through the digital code and the invitation or inventation of virtual space. With this, the lost reference system of space-time is also disappearing. This new age enables the creation of digital worlds and the dematerialization of the existing world, as well as the displacement of reality from sensory perception. Aesthetic disappears. Simulation blurs the difference between the imaginary and reality. The concept of landscape dissolves. The signs of landscape, the mountains, river, lakes, and forests, so often referred to, no longer refer to anything. Norbert Schneider comments on this in his History of Aesthetics from the Enlightenment to Postmodernism, I quote, particularly in computer aesthetics and in the TV landscape, with the glamour worlds filled with exchange values, the levels of reality can hardly be separated anymore with commodity aesthetics increasingly consuming the primary level of reality. For Baudrillard, it is characteristic that he, not without melancholy, for he certainly sees the principle of death behind it, death only repressed and postponed in exchange, tries to make this corruption of sensuality bearable in feigned cynical acceptance. The old worlds of life have capitulated to these new developments. Baudrillard was therefore right, so to speak, of an agony of the real with the title of one of his books. The agony of the real has become entangled, end of quote. The agony of the real has become entangled with new geopolitical realities in these pandemic times, of course. To re-engage with, learn with the earth has become as much a real political struggle as a form of poetic engagement, as much a way of facing the Anthropocene as artistic reimagining the posthuman conundrum. Can we overcome the Gothic doom of our aesthetic categories, the agony of the real? To learn with the earth would mean to apply a completely different aesthetic category, one we almost forgot, damn our dementia, abundance. Spending time in the Safjental, amidst its industrious people, dwellings, forests, meadows, and rivers, within the ridges and gorges of mountains and stones, one might start to question the paradigm of scarcity, so prevalent in the tales of late capitalism. Instead of fighting with each other over resources, we could learn to partake without the dogma of extraction, becoming more like the bees, which return to the valley every year to pollinate and harvest, producing the sweet nectar we crave. If we think in terms of scarcity, we have already lost to the forces of extraction logic. If we immerse ourselves in the abundance of the valley, of nature, of which we are a part of, we might learn to pollinate while harvesting. If we look closely at the projects by the artists of the Safjental Biennale, we notice a new approach to face the megalithon and the Anthropocene and our developing Alzheimer's in relation to ourselves. The shift is simple but tectonic in its consequences. Instead of learning from the earth, we could learn with the earth, listen to its sounds, observe and become obsessed with the eyes of fish, create gardens and pictures of plants on walls, which we breathe, the oxygen they produce. Create new terrain vagues from within nature and from the perspective of the forest and the grass, the rivers and the mountains. Set out on a quest to make the potential of this wealth of experience poetically effective for all of us, illuminating our minds. Thank you very much.
I can be, yes, I can pretty much start with one. It's really nice. I really like this concept that you bring forward, the learning with, and you cite many scholars and really interesting thinkers. Many of them. Well, yes, many of them we are very familiar with. But I wonder also, whether perhaps it's a commentary more than a question. There are these feminist scholars like Donna Haraway, thinking about symposiums and learning with or wording with, as opposed to kind of copoiesis as a term which she brings in as scholarship. And I think there is quite a lot of interesting thought there that could be also borrowed from in terms of this learning with. But perhaps my question would be, what are the political dimensions of your learning with the Arab? Could you comment on this?
So Yes, I know that this excerpt of my thinking is really all-attitude leaning, right? And the only female thinker mentioned was Sedgwick, who's very, very important though. It has to do with the history of ideas and the history of aesthetics, of course. But in contemporary thinking, there's many, many female thinkers, which could be quoted in addition to Sedgwick, and maybe I should then in a written form also. Politically, this is what I mean by the real political consequences of this way of aesthetics and the way it influences our thinking within the discourse on what's happening in Europe at the moment, for example. I think this rhetoric of scarcity is something which comes on the one hand from the left and from circles that were concerned with the well-being of the earth in the 70s and the 80s. Let's say the Club of Rome, for example, who predicted the end of growth and the end of resources and all this kind of things. Aesthetically, this idea of scarcity starts with Malthus and has been a problem ever since. And I think this is really at the core of a lot of things. If we think about scarcity and from a perspective of scarcity, instead of a perspective of abundance, then we will always struggle with each other about limited resources, for example, water, oil, whatever you want. You can look at it from different points of view, and this is also an aesthetical problem in as much as it is a philosophical one. I would argue this is learning with the earth, is to learn from a place of abundance. We're at the moment in this Turnhalle, but go outside and look at the fucking beauty of this valley, right? It's incredible. And it's so beautiful, and the abundance of nature is so overwhelming if you're here. And I think this is a completely different mindset. I'm not a hippie or, love, peace, and rock and roll kind of type, but I think if we look at the discussions, for example, about energy prices and winter now, instead of an argument of scarcity to an argument of abundance, we have so much empathy and solidarity with the people of Ukraine that we're willing to be a little bit colder in winter. This is an argument of abundance. Instead of, because now our politicians gave up neutrality in Switzerland, we have to freeze, because poor Putin is turning down our gas, right? These are two completely different concepts. And this is, there was an article at Kunstbild about the Safienthal Biennale just now coming out 2 days ago, and talks about Markus Meder, he talks about the Bitnik work that Johannes showed, and he talks about a space of resonance and about this discourse that we have when it comes to the climate crisis, that we have to learn to reduce our needs. And I think this is the discourse in a wrong way, that if instead of always talking about the things we will miss, we will talk about the things that we'd gain, it would be a different discourse. So that's my argument towards the aesthetic of mountains. Or in other words, fuck mountains.
Thanks so much. Any questions, any comments, any reflections? Oh yes, yeah. So sorry, so the beginning of the conversation about emerging protocol, but I mean, this is the concept of abundance versus scarcity, but also thinking about like value, like this value playing into this conversation. Well, politics of like abundance, like it's like value and like debt, like so like we can start this over. They talk about like value, debt, and body becomes, you know, even natural resources and commodities like that become like something that's circulatable and value isn't ascribed to it. Is there like a refusal of value as well, and thinking about like abundance versus scarcity? Because scarcity is what makes value kind of like non-tangible, like just kind of like explodes to the point where, you know, the value kind of like becomes out of control.
Well, the value, I'm not quite sure which value you talk about, right? But the value you criticize maybe is the value of commodification. And the value of commodification is, of course, inscribed within our history. So I just mentioned it to be precise, that Linnaeus, of course, besides inventing this wonderful system of classification, also was a huge part of the system of classification as colonization, right? Which then becomes part of this whole process of commodification. And there's a very lovely little book. No, it's not lovely. It's a very interesting and thought-provoking and intelligent book, but lovely to read, by Kathy Youssef, called "A Billion Black Anthropocenes Unknown," which can be freely downloaded for everybody. It makes exactly this argument, right? That through the commodification of the value within the history, and from a European perspective, over the black body, of course, kind of created these kind of values. Which is, if you look at the, so this is now a very dicey area of argument, but I think it's an interesting one to make. So if you look at the Caribbean, where this system of slavery, of European slavery, basically started with black bodies being kidnapped in Africa and brought there as workforces. In the Caribbean, you do not need to cultivate these kind of things which require these kind of workforces. You find plenty of food laying around. You just have to walk down the beach and this stuff. You can eat as much as you want in the Caribbean, wherever you are. So this scarcity of workforce is an invention. And through this invention, we added value by inventing debt and all these kind of things, thus creating a monetary system we now call capitalism. It's very complex, but this theory of what capital actually is when it comes to money is, of course, connected to the invention of debt. This is what you ask about. So if we would have looked at it from a perspective of abundance, you walk down the beach in the Caribbean and you just pick up fruits and eat fish and are happy. You know, that would have been a completely different perspective. But because we have this Malthusian perspective of scarcity, which maybe is in Europe based on Christian teachings, we have this huge problem in our minds. We're always talking about the history of ideas, huh? Not about other things. I would argue to your question. I would argue towards your question. But being very insecure about the walking down the street, beach and fun.
Yeah, I'm like just interested in like abundance, like can you fall into that? Like, is it private or not to fall into like the same circulation of value? If you think about it.
I think from this concept, we could learn from and with the earth, the way that Amerindian people did, or if you think about Yoruba philosophy in what is now Nigeria, if you think about different concept of Sami when it comes to the abundance of reindeer, for example, there's different philosophical concepts which are also aesthetical ones. Then it doesn't lead to commodification. And I think this is the fundamental difference. This is all very theoretical now, and you seem to be very well informed, but this is, as you're completely right, this is at the core of this little argument I tried to make poetically.
No, it's really interesting. Like I think about abundance, kind of like other alternative knowledge systems, that's what I do in my work. So they're interested in kind of like, and very careful to not like kind of even thing like, you know, ecosystems of like academy that I could teach them and how that feeds into them. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is a question, but an observation. A, I would say to the question, who are the indigenous people of Europe? Or do you describe the indigenous people of Europe?
This is just the other case that is coming.
Who are the indigenous people of Europe?
When you talk about the sort of, you know, the indigenous people's knowledge, and it's not sort of very, you know, I mean, there is an indigenous person living in Zurich as much as there's an indigenous person living here. So I kind of far, you know, on a sort of provocative level, you can say, like, if you read one of the last murders kind of creative writings that when you go up to the other part of the French, begin to say, that tacit knowledge goes out of that man's head. It's going to die with him. So now we are like 30 years later since this book, and scientists up and down Europe, the rest of the world, trying to reconnect with the grandchildren of those tacit knowledge people who died a long time ago. So that's kind of, I find the word indigenous people very problematic. Within, let's say, just the European context, because it's in the context I really know. And then the other thing I sort of wanted to mention was, of course, we are all aware that 90% of the children which are involved in Europe at some time spend 90% of their living hours in front of screens, rather than in Anschauungsunterricht, as they may have been done in 1970. Teacher, for example, kids are there, and the biology lesson is not in front of the big screen, but actually with the dandelions and the butterflies in the field. So I was thinking, if you really want to make the next generation of children experience abundance, then you have to disrupt the education system as it's been propagated to many parts of Europe, and either do reconnect with some of the old or China and gold on a much bigger scale. Because those people who live in the centre of London and to go to 2,000 kids plus school will not experience abundance of nature. They might experience the green nature, they will experience abundance of not so much people somewhere. It's not really fresh air. And I think that's sort of the reality of a large amount of people. Mega cities and so forth, you know, Hong Kong, or big cities that have lots of children which will have difficulty experiencing any other abundance than fellow humans.
Well, I think that depends a little bit of what you would call abundance, right? And this critique of the virtual through Baudrillard wasn't meant to be a critique of the virtual worlds that a lot of young people inhabit in general. It was more meant to talk about the simulacra of an aesthetic of nature. You can, I believe, but this has to be tested. You could live in Lagos, one of those megacities, and Mumbai, and you know, find a small bee's nest in a construction site in one of those terrain vagues, in the original sense of the concept by by architects and experience abundance through that relation. But this kind of learning is relational, right? And I would argue full learning always along the lines of Brazilian categories of education, that learning is a relational process, and learning with the earth would then be relational if we understand it to be on the same page as us, or that we have a reciprocal relationship towards these kind of things. And this kind of abundance could be encountered and can be encountered and is encountered, I'm quite sure, in Mumbai, in Lagos, or in Sao Paulo by young people and children. It can also be encountered by somebody in one of these endlessly interesting virtual spaces I don't know shit about, but I heard are really fascinating. I think it's about reciprocity, the reciprocal approach towards the idea of learning within and with nature. The concept of indigenous, the way I use it, means to have a common experience, culturally integrating the knowledge of nature's intelligence within teaching and learning. And this can be Amerindian cultures, this can be the Yoruba culture I talked about. This can be some farmers here that still have these ideas and maybe live by it. This has to be discovered. Maybe you know them better than I do. Of course, the Sami I mentioned, some villages in southern Italy. You can find it everywhere. I think it's a certain way of integration, of being still able to learn with the earth. That's exactly my argument. And this takes it, back to the original meaning of the word indigenous, I think. But it's a difficult concept and discussion, of course.
We hope to continue this more, perhaps 2 months as well. I just you also asked a very quick question and a very quick answer, please.
Yes.
By you, because we are already into intervention. So
oh, sorry.
Just 2 minutes. So afterwards, I totally agree with the abundance perspective. There's one other discussion. The competition that for me is also like essential to know right now, and specifically to refer to the wildlife thinking in terms of that. It's not happening in Europe now, but in other places like in the States and I think also in Australia. The market has somehow created this image that we are sometimes in competition with water rights, specifically when it's a drought season. And like I said, it's not yet happening in Europe, but there is like a possibility that somehow the market could create this idea that we are in competition with water, and then they try to access. I mean, they sell water rights. This is not their thing. More like a card how they sell respond to the application.
I'm fascinated by these court cases at the moment all over the world, where a group of hippie freaks try to make it possible for rivers, for example, to become persons in the eyes of the law and to have rights as persons, as beings. And I think, this whole aesthetic of abundance would very much argue in this direction, that a river is a being and has to be legally and philosophically respected as thus. This would change the whole water right discussion completely, for example. It would actually put it on its head. And that's happening. That's not just happening with rivers, but also with specific mountains and on and on and on. And this is really, really interesting because it's very, very dangerous for the concept of commodification of water, for example.